Hello, everyone. Welcome to our program, The 1913 Flood and the Move of Osborn. My name is Melissa Dalton, and I am the Public Outreach Coordinator for the Greene County Record Center and Archives. So before we get into our program, we'd like to just give you a little bit of information about our facility. The Greene County Archives is a historical repository for Greene County. So we hold all of the historical records for the county. So any department that creates records, if they deem them to be historic, we're going to hold them. So the types of records we may hold will include things like probate records, which include estates, wills, marriage, adoption, birth and death records. It could be clerk of court records, which would include divorce, early naturalization, criminal cases, civil disputes. Could also be tax records, deeds, mortgages, survey records, maps. There are a number of different types of records. Now, this photograph is actually of our reading room, and this is the space people come to use our records. Now, our records date back to 1803. Anyone want to take a guess as to why that is? Well, not only was Ohio established, gained statehood in 1803, but also Greene County. Greene County is one of the oldest counties in Ohio. It actually used to go all the way up to Lake Erie, and it wasn't until 1819 that it got its current borders. So when people come in to do research, this is where they're going to sit to do it, here in our reading room. This is a photo of our stacks. So this is most of our main storage area for our records. And many of our records are kept in what we call record center boxes, as you can see in this photograph. So this would be records that are kept in file folders, individual papers. Now, one of the reasons just so you know, our stacks are employee only. So you can only go back there if you're an employee. And there are a few reasons for this. One may be that, like you can see here, there's a lot of boxes, which means there's a lot of individual papers. So if we just let anybody walk back there and start pulling records out, there's a potential that that record wouldn't make it back into the same box or into the same file. So one way is to make sure it keeps its order. Another reason could be that some of our records are, like we said, they were maybe 1803, and so they're older, which means they could start to be, maybe they're starting to deteriorate, starting to break down. Maybe they're brittle, maybe they have tears. So we want to provide them a little more protection and cut down on how much they're handled. So maybe they're kept back here. And there's also security reasons. So if the majority of our records are basically behind closed doors, then we don't have to worry about maybe a piece of paper walking away. Today, we're going to be using primary and secondary resources to learn about the 1913 flood and the move of Osborn. So someone tell me, what is a primary resource? A primary resource, they are the original documents or objects that are created at a time of the event. So this is somebody who has firsthand experience. So what are some examples of a primary resource? Some examples may include photographs, maps, sound recordings, diaries, letters, birth certificates, any of those records that we talked about earlier. Those are all considered primary resources. So, what is a secondary resource? A secondary resource, they are interpretations of events that are created by someone without the firsthand experience. So, what would be some examples of this? So some examples may include textbooks, encyclopedias. So today, maybe you use Wikipedia or Google, something along those lines. Those are considered secondary resources. As are newspapers and magazine articles. Sometimes these can be considered first or primary resources, but majority of the time you're going to hear them listed as secondary. So we're going to be using a bunch of different types of records today to learn about the 1913 flood and the move of Osborn. So before we actually get into the question, is this a primary or secondary resource here? This photograph. It's a primary resource, right? This is actually a photograph of downtown Dayton. And this is before or at the beginning stages of the flooding during the 1913 flood. So the 1913 flood began on March 21st, 1913. It was actually Good Friday. And it started out as a windstorm. And it was probably, you think March, it's early spring. And so the temperatures were kind of warmish, like 60 degrees maybe. And within 24 hours, the temperatures dropped significantly, almost 30 degrees, and it started to rain. And Dayton received 8 to 11 inches of rainfall within 4 days. That's the equivalent to 3 months worth of rainfall. And then on top of that, you have to remember that this is, right after the winter time, there was already a lot of snow that had melted. So the ground was completely saturated with all that snow melt. So as this rain fell, it had nowhere to go, which meant 90% of the rain that fell became runoff. And by Tuesday, March 25th, the levees of the Great Miami River in downtown Dayton. So if you are familiar with downtown Dayton, you can think of Riverscape. That's the Great Miami River, okay? So the levees around the Great Miami River failed, and 20 feet of water rushed into downtown Dayton. So this is the beginning stages of the flooding. So I want you guys to examine this photograph. Take a look and take a moment to discuss, what do you see? What are some things you notice about this photograph? All right. So there's a man about waist deep. So if the water's about waist deep on the average height man, you're probably looking at about 3 feet of water. The big circle there, that's probably just some debris. So it could be a tree, it could be something else. There's people at that line, it looks like a telephone pole, and there's a lot of debris around them as well. And if you look over there, over where that Jenkins drugstore is, we put an arrow there to show you there's not a whole lot of space between the top of that or the awning and the water. So there's a significant amount of rain already in downtown Dayton, or a significant amount of flooding already in downtown Dayton. Let's look at another photograph of downtown Dayton. So what do you think? Do you think the water's higher? Why are some reasons? Right. So you notice here, there are 3 horses in this water. Now, horses are fairly tall. You're probably looking at between 5 and 6 feet to the top of their head, depending on the size of the horse. So although they're likely swimming, we're still probably looking at a significant amount of water. Now, something to keep in mind when we're thinking about horses. In 1913, horses were still the main mode of transportation for most people. So that's the way they were still getting around. Now, do you also see there's still debris next to those 2 black horses? You can see the debris there. And if you look over by that lamppost over in the bottom left-hand corner, we have an arrow to it. And we have a whirlpool that has started. So there's obviously quite a current in that water. And I have another small arrow over by that church. And you can see it looks like we're pointing, that's actually a top of a fence post. So again, we're probably looking at 4 to 5 feet worth of water, of rainwater or flooding waters. Do you think the water's higher in this photograph? Absolutely. So what are some indications of the height of water? I want you guys to take a look and look really carefully. Look in those buildings. So what do you think? Is there more water in this photograph? Are the floodwaters higher? Absolutely. So let's take a look at some of this. Now, if you look at the inn, you can see that the first floor of the inn, the ground level, is completely flooded in. You can't even see the doors. Now, do you see all those people in the window? We've circled them. So there are people stuck in this building. So I want you guys to discuss, what do you think these people are going to do? What is their best course of action for survival? Right, they are going to keep going higher, as high as they need to go, as high as they can go, until they can be rescued. Because you're not going to jump into this water, are you? Remember, it's early March, so the water is really cold. Additionally, there's obviously a fast current. You can look at the street lamp here. We got a circle, and you can see the current coming off of that street lamp. It's a really good indicator of how deep the water is. There's also debris under the water. So you never know, if you were to jump in, what you might hit. Okay? So you have to be, the smart thing to do is to go higher and wait to be rescued. Now remember, in that last slide, we had those horses. So what do you think the horses did? Do you think that they were able to get to higher ground? Not all of them were able to. Roughly 1,400 horses and another 2,000 domestic animals, because that could include also livestock, but also pets. They died in the flood. They weren't able to get out in time. So it's just a reminder that flooding happens very quickly and that you have to make quick choices. Now, this is an artistic rendering of the Dayton flood. And you'll notice here that the artist really wanted to just show the sheer chaos in downtown Dayton. So you can see that there's a lot of debris in the water. You can also, if you look right in that main thoroughfare, that's actually Main Street, they have a whole house in the water. There were homes that were literally just washed away. You can also see that they show lightning and fire. So there was a lot going on. But I want you guys to look at this. What do you think were causing fires during the flood? Take a moment and talk about that. So the fires were actually caused by damaged gas lines. So most of Dayton was still powered by gas at this time. So gas lines were left open when the flooding started. And most of the fire crews were unable to get to these fires that developed due to the flooding. And almost an entire city block was destroyed due to the fire. And so this was a significant event that's already happening. You already have the flood, now you have these fires. And they actually estimated that it was roughly $100 million in 1913 of property damage. So $100 million worth of property damage in 1913. What do you think the equivalent of that is today? Today, that's equal to about $2 billion. However, Dayton was pretty lucky in the fact that they had a lot of people who went out of their way to rescue those who were in danger. There was a famous company from Dayton called the National Cash Register. National Cash Register was owned by John Patterson. And John Patterson made it very clear that he was going to do everything he could to help the residents of Dayton. So he had his employees send out rescue boats. He set up his property to provide temporary housing. They set up one of their factories as a temporary shelter as well. He did a lot to help the city recover. And then once the city had started to recover, he also helped with the cleanup efforts after the fact. So this is a photograph of an NCR rescue party bringing people in from flooded areas. Now you all have a timeline in front of you, so let's look at some questions and answer. We'll go through some questions and have you guys answer them based on this timeline. So our first question is, how high did the floodwaters reach in Dayton? And how many stories of a building is that? What's the equivalent? So look at this timeline and find where it mentions floodwaters. Right. So here on March 26th, the water crest reaches 20 feet in downtown Dayton. And that's about the equivalent to 2 stories. So you're looking at a 2-story building. How about the next question? What year was the original town of Osborn established? Osborn was established in 1851, and you look below it and there's a map from 1855. So just a few years after it was established, that's the map that we have. Question 3. How many homes were destroyed? And how many people were left homeless after the flood? This one you have to look a little closely. Maybe look for a newspaper heading or newspaper headline. That's just a little hint. So the answer to number 3, there were 20,000 homes destroyed. That's on this one that says March 27th through 31st. And roughly 70,000 people were left homeless. And you can actually see that in the Denver Times headline. Well, let's look at the last question. Question number 4. So what did they do to ensure that a disaster such as this nature, such as the 1913 flood, never happened again? So they actually decided to build 5 dams to control the flow of other rivers into the Great Miami. So these dams are actually built on tributaries of the Great Miami River. So these were constructed between 1919 and 1922. But the dam that we want to discuss, the one that's of most consequence to us today, is Huffman Dam. So this is actually Huffman Dam. Huffman Dam was built along the Mad River, and it's actually close to Riverside and Fairborn today. This dam, although it's not the largest, you can actually tell by looking at this photograph, it's still pretty massive in scale. You look at the bottom here, and you can see the men working on it. So it's still pretty large. Now this is an aerial or a bird's eye view photograph of Huffman Dam after it was completed. So that means the photograph was taken by an airplane, an aerial photograph. Now today, for those who might be familiar with Huffman Dam, there's actually a bike path that goes over top of it. So you might have ridden on a bike across it, or maybe you've taken walks and jogs. But that's where Huffman Dam is today. Now, Huffman Dam controls the flow of the Mad River into the Great Miami River. But something that's important to note here is that when the Miami Conservancy District, which was the organization tasked with building the dams, when they started working on Huffman Dam, they didn't realize at the time, but because of the placement of the dam, there was a potential that an entire village could be flooded if there was ever another natural disaster. To really look at this, let's just kind of get our bearings. Let's figure out where we are. So this is actually an 1855 map of Greene County. So where we're actually looking at today is going to be Bath Township. So that's the top left township there, up in that top left corner. Let's take a closer look. So this is Bath Township. And if you notice, if you look along the left-hand side there, there is a river that runs up to almost, goes up to Osborn. And Osborn's up in that top corner. Now you'll notice with Osborn's placement, they are actually in the floodplain. Now this is really problematic. This is a really big problem for Osborn because of where the Huffman Dam is located, which is closer to that Kingsley. You see that's listed there. It's probably a little closer to that region, maybe a little further down, Huffman Dam. Now, when the dam is built, if they were to have any kind of flooding or a lot of water, all of the water behind the dam, that's going to be what they call like the retaining or the reservoir. So Osborn was actually going to be part of that new reservoir for any kind of floodwaters. And they determined that if there was another natural disaster like the 1913 flood, Osborn would be completely flooded. Now, this is a photograph of Osborn. Someone want to tell me? I told you what type of photograph another one like this was. Do you want to know what this is? This is an aerial photograph, meaning it was taken by an airplane. So this is Osborn. And you can see here that this is almost the entire village, so it's not very big. But you can see there's industry, so there's a railroad that runs through the center of town. There are some businesses. There are homes. And so it's not very big. But they determined that because of this potential of flooding in the future, that the entire village was going to have to be vacated. Everyone was going to have to evacuate. Now, they knew that the potential of flooding was probably not anytime soon, so they did have time to make these decisions, but all the residents, they weren't given the option to stay. So if you were a resident of Osborn, what do you think you would say? What do you think you would do? Well, the residents actually came up with a really creative solution. They decided that they were just going to pick up their entire village and move it 2 miles southeast. So they actually ended up moving 200 houses 2 miles southeast. So this is actually a photograph of the Zeller family moving their home. So how did they do this? What they did was they would jack up the house like you would a car if you were going to do work on a car, and they placed some sort of blocks or supports underneath the house, and then they'd put a trailer underneath it, and then they would attach that trailer to a large tractor, and they called these tank-like tractors and wagons, and some were wagons drawn by horses too. So this is a photograph of Miss Zeller sitting on top of the tractor. But this tank-like tractor, you needed something powerful to move your home, didn't you? Because although most homes in the 1920s were made of wood, they're still heavy. You might not have had indoor plumbing. You weren't going to have a basement. You probably didn't have electricity. So that made the move a little bit easier, but it's still a big feat. It's still going to be a big project. So they wanted to make sure that they had the right equipment to get the job done properly. This is the Side and Stick family moving their home. Again, you can see the house has been jacked up. They've got the blocks underneath it and the trailer is set up. And again, you have this really large tank-like tractor. Now, we actually have a fun story to tell. One of my coworkers, when she was doing an interview, an oral history with a former resident of Osborn, he told her of an experiment he tried when they were moving their home. So what he decided to do was he filled up a glass with water and he placed it on the kitchen counter. So the cup was left there, the glass was left there for the entire move. Now the move took roughly 3 hours to move 2 miles. Okay? So, what do you think he found when they got the house to its new location? The glass actually stayed in the exact same place, and not a drop of water was spilled. Now, you have to remember, if it took 3 hours to move 2 miles, that's a long time. So you could have walked there a lot quicker than this house got there. So that just goes to show how much care they took in moving these homes. Now, it took about 2 years to move all 200 homes. So they started the process in about 1922 and they completed it in 1924. And here you can see the village, they actually moved right next to Fairfield. So this is an aerial photograph of Osborn and Fairfield after the towns finished their moves. This is 1924, so this is soon after they had moved pretty much all the homes. So you can see here the aerial. So let's look at the next slide so we can actually see a map of what it looks like. So this is after they moved and they had been coexisting. So Fairfield and Osborn were neighbors for a long time. So this is actually a map from 1941. So we can see here the two towns coexisting. Now, after coexisting for roughly 25 years, Osborn and Fairfield begin talking about merging their towns. Now, each town had their own police and fire and municipal governments, and they were each kind of confined by the neighboring towns, so they weren't able to really grow because of the neighboring town and also because of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So they decided that it would probably be in their best interest if they merged. So in 1949, the two towns took a vote, and the merger was approved by the citizens, and that merger was completed in 1950. And so to demonstrate the merger and the history of the two towns, the new city, voted to also merge their former names. So they took Fair from Fairfield and Born from Osborn, creating the new Fairborn. Well, we hope you enjoyed the presentation today, and we welcome any questions you may have, so feel free to contact me at the information listed here on this slide. And if you're interested in learning more about our programming, please check out our website. We do have a lot of educational and student resources. We also complete a weekly blog, so you can learn about a lot of other topics that we discuss there. We have an online presence on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, so you can check those out. We have a lot of posts out there pretty much daily. And we also have a Flickr account which provides some various records for you to review online as well. So we hope you enjoyed the presentation and have a great day.